We shall move on to the next session, which is Track 1, Unstoppable, Thriving Beyond Limits in Profession and Life. Ladies and gentlemen, this virtual session titled Unstoppable, Thriving Beyond Limits in Profession and Life. We often hear about resilience, but today we have the privilege of learning from someone who embodies it. Our speaker is not just a doctor, not just a lawyer, but a testament to what's possible when determination meets purpose. Despite facing challenges that many would call limitations, they have shattered expectations, proving that success is not defined by circumstances, but the mindset we choose. So get ready to be inspired, to challenge your own limits, and to walk away with a renewed belief in what is truly possible. Before our speaker joins us virtually, I would like to introduce a little bit about his profile. Our speaker today, Dr. Dinesh Palipana, is dialing in from Brisbane, Australia. Dr. Dinesh Palipana is an Australian doctor, lawyer, scientist, and disability advocate. He is the first quadriplegic medical intern in Queensland, Australia. He is the second person with quadriplegia to graduate as a doctor in Australia and first with spinal cord injury. Without further ado, Dr. Dinesh, the floor is yours.
But I'm glad to join you virtually. Life feels like a dream sometimes. And often I think about how lucky I am, how grateful I am. It hasn't been an easy journey to get here today, but still, I think sometimes challenges and hardships are what makes us. I want to share with you a little bit about this journey today and hopefully leave with you some things to think about. My life started in 1984 in Sri Lanka. I lived in Sri Lanka until I was 10 years old, and we lived through the civil war in that country. It was an incredibly difficult time for people, and I often think back to the violence and the suffering and the poverty that we saw during our time in Sri Lanka. These days, when we talk about disability and inclusion and the work that we're all passionate about, I think it's important to think about people in the parts of the world who will never have the opportunity to access what we do. I look at what's happening in the Middle East and Ukraine, some parts of Africa, and people like me who have spinal cord injuries, use a wheelchair, or have other disabilities, don't know whether they'll live to see the next day. They have bombs falling around them. And indeed, Sri Lanka was the same when I was a kid. So we lived through a war. We lived through a lot of struggle. We lived through a lot of suffering. Sri Lanka taught me a couple of things. It taught me the importance of perspective. And I think perspective is important for all of us, isn't it? Today, I'm here in Brisbane, in Australia, living a very happy life that I'm grateful for. But I remember that in other parts of the world, like my country of birth, many people will never be able to realize this kind of life. And I think that reminds me every day to do as much good and to squeeze every little drop out of what's been gifted to me. Sri Lanka also taught me something else, and I think coming here, sharing this time with you in Malaysia, I suspect that Malaysia probably shares a similar philosophy, and that's the value of education. When I was going to school, I went to school with some really, really poor kids. These were kids who didn't have shoes. There were kids who lived in huts made out of clay. The roofs were made out of coconut leaves. And I remember going to school with them, and they came to school in their old uniforms that they've had for years. They came to school barefoot. They came to school without lunch. And our school was very basic as well. There was no electricity or running water, anything like that. There was just a room, some tables, and we studied. But something struck me about these kids. And in a country like Sri Lanka, where there is so much poverty and struggle, where people live without hope for so many years, these kids valued education, their families valued education. And that's because in a place like Sri Lanka, and I think, anywhere in the world, education is one thing that can empower a person to live a fruitful life, that empowers a person to become economically independent. It empowers a person to realize their dreams, to feed their family, and to find a better life. But you know what? I sustained a spinal cord injury at the age of 25. I became paralyzed. And education was the first thing that was nearly taken away from me. We're here talking about employment, and I listened to some of the conversations from earlier today. I listened to some of the questions. And a lot of it revolves around employment, right? How do we be a more inclusive employer? How do we empower people to find a job? But you know what the precursor to all that is? It's education. And I think we are failing people with education from the start. We're failing people to access education. We're denying people the opportunity to become educated. We're making assumptions about their life, about their capability. I experienced all of these things after having a spinal cord injury. But I knew from my time in Sri Lanka as a kid that education was the one thing that was going to set me free. I lived the first 10 years of my life in Sri Lanka. And then my family got the opportunity to move to Australia in 1994. I turned 40 last year. So for the last 30 years, we've been living in Australia. And it's been a happy life. We first landed in Sydney. And we start life from the very basics. We lived in this tiny little apartment. There was 4 of us. We slept on the floor. We didn't have any furniture. There was no money. Mum and Dad didn't have jobs when we first came here. But we started from the basics. We started building a life again. My dad got a job. And a few years later, we bought our first house. And we started making some progress in this life as migrants to a new country. Then I finally graduated from high school. And as we're talking about our shared interests today in this conversation, I think one of the most important things is understanding purpose, understanding the why. I don't know if any of you have seen Simon Sinek's TED Talk or read his book, but Simon talks about starting with the why. Why? Why do we get up out of bed every morning? Why do we have these conversations? What is our purpose on this earth? Why? What energizes us? What is that thing? We got to start with the why. When I finished high school, I didn't know what my why was. I didn't know what drove me. I didn't know what my values were. I didn't know why I was on this planet. And I needed to discover that. I didn't know that. But to me, those days, I thought that success was having a corporate job. Success was having a house and a mortgage. Success was getting married. And success was having a nice car to drive around in. I thought that was success. So I started chasing these things. I applied to study law after finishing high school, got into law. I became a very materialistic person. And I started to do the wrong things. When I was studying law, I partied, I mixed with the wrong crowd, and my life spiraled out of control. Eventually, I became depressed. Depression was one of the most challenging things that I've ever been through. These days, I work as a doctor in the emergency department, and our emergency department is one of the busiest in this country, one of the busiest in the Southern Hemisphere. And in the course of work, I see people who have reached the end of the road with depression, people who have tried to end their lives. I've seen my own colleagues end up with this. Depression is one of the most isolating things. It's one of the most difficult things, and it's a hidden thing. I started to struggle at university. I failed subjects. I lost my job as a law clerk. I stopped going outside. I ended up being in my house most of the time. And I was too afraid. I was anxious. I started getting panic attacks, and my world fell apart. But sometimes the challenges that we have, the obstacles that we face, they are a signpost for us to stop, rethink life. They are difficulties that help us find ourselves. And I think even spiritually, it is said that the universe or God puts things in front of us that we need to face. And for me, depression was one of these things. Fortunately, I started to see a doctor. This doctor was incredible. And I've been taught that our job as a doctor is not to treat a disease that a person has, but rather is to treat a person who has a disease. And those two things are very different philosophies. My doctor helped me through the depression. He treated me with kindness and like a human being. And after many months, I recovered. And I remember the very day when I realized that I was out of the depression. My whole world changed. I started to go out again. I started to see friends. I started succeeding at university. And my entire world became different. My mum, she's one of the most important people in my life. She's taught me so many things. And without her, I wouldn't be here today. My mum says that by helping one person, we may not change the world, but we will change the world for them. This is what my doctor did for me. He changed my world. And he inspired me to become a doctor myself. That became purpose. That became my why. And so I finished law school. I sat the entrance exam for medicine. I did the interviews and I got into medical school. That is how I found my why and my purpose. And from that day, I have loved every moment of being in medicine. But that experience with depression also taught me that there are so many hidden things that we don't see, right? We don't see someone's depression. We don't see someone's dyslexia. We don't see someone's autism sometimes. There are so many invisible things that we don't see in people. And I think we have to extend kindness, the benefit of the doubt, and opportunities for people who come across these challenges. Medical school was going well. And in that time, I actually got the opportunity to visit Malaysia as well on a holiday in those first couple of years. I loved Malaysia. Kuala Lumpur was amazing. I ate a lot. Malaysian food is incredible. And I can't wait to come back to Malaysia sometime and try the incredible food and see the people. It was one of the most special memories of my life. But life changed on the 31st of January 2010. I was 25 years old. I went to visit my mum, and when I was driving back about an hour away to get back to where I was studying medicine, I came across a wet road and a water puddle. And when my car hit the water puddle, it lost control and I was involved in a motor vehicle accident. When the car landed, after rolling and rolling and rolling, the car landed on the side of the road. It was upright, but I was alive. I thought I was going to die in that accident because it was so violent, but I was alive, and I was glad to be alive. And then I tried to get out of the car, but I couldn't. I realized that I was paralyzed. In fact, I was paralyzed from the chest down. And I knew in those moments that my life would not be the same again. I spent 7 or 8 months in hospital. I was operated on my neck, and I had to learn how to use a wheelchair. I had to learn how to do things with my hands again. I had to learn how to sit upright, how to get in and out of bed, how to speak a full sentence again. It was a grueling journey to get my life back. My dad left my mum. We were alone. And when I left the hospital, we didn't have anywhere to live, and we jumped from place to place. A lot of people told me that my career as a doctor was over, that I'll never be a doctor again. But I didn't want to let that go because there is no room for regret in this life. And I knew that if I at least didn't try, I will regret it for the rest of my life. So I fought. A lot of academics in the medical school said that it can't be done, that I'll not pass my exams, that I can't be a doctor in a wheelchair, that the patients won't take me seriously. Fortunately, I had enough good people that fought for me, and I got my opportunity to come back to medical school. And I want to encourage you. It's easy to do the right thing on a good day. It's easy to empower someone and to enable someone in the good times. But people did it for me in the hard times. People fought for me. And finally, I got my opportunity to come back to medical school. I worked hard. I used to do 20-hour days every day and sleep for a few hours and did it all over again. But a couple of years later, I graduated, the first quadriplegic medical graduate in Queensland. Then I got my job. I had to fight for the job, but I started work in 2017. And here we are, 9 years later. I work as a doctor in the busiest emergency department in the country. You know what? I figured out how to do my job using technology, using dictation, using ultrasound. I figured out how to examine a patient. You know what the funny thing is? In my first year as a doctor, I was faster than everyone else. I was seeing 25% more patients than some of my colleagues, the average colleague. Was awarded the Junior Doctor of the Year for Gold Coast Health in 2018. The patients have been amazing. I've seen thousands of patients now. And not one has ever asked for another doctor. Not one has ever asked me whether I can do my job. It's been an incredible journey. I've learned to stretch myself. And over the last few years, I've flown an aeroplane. I've written a book, which is getting turned into a TV series. I have been a model at Australian Fashion Week. I have done so many things that I have never imagined that I will be able to do. I think the limitations that we place on ourselves and others are often just in our minds. Some people, they ask, why not? But I think the trick is, I think some people ask, why? Why should we do something? But actually, I think the victory, I think the winners are the people who say, why not? I'm going to leave you with one last story. I know that we're stretched for time, and I know that the clock is ticking. I'm going to leave you with one last story. When I was in the hospital, I was stuck in this hospital bed, and there was a dirty old curtain surrounding it, and I hated it. I hated that place. But one of my friends, she hung up the poem Invictus on that curtain. Invictus, it means undefeated or invincible. And the poem goes through the journey of a man who experiences incredible hardship. Towards the end of the poem, he says that he will not bow down and that he is the master of his fate and the captain of his soul. So I encourage you, please fight for those people, enable people, think about why not rather than why. And remember through these challenges, never to bow down, and that we are the masters of our fate and the captains of our soul. Thanks for giving me your time today.